So this would have been back in the probably about 84, winter of 84. I just moved to Illinois from a suburb of Milwaukee. I was staying at my sister's house in Winnetka, which is a pretty nice suburb. And I was staying there for a couple of months until I found an apartment in the city that I eventually moved to. The car I had at the time was a Volkswagen Type 3, which is kind of a cross between the old traditional Bug and a Karmann Ghia. So it's kind of a squashed, elongated Bug. It had some really interesting engineering things to it, one of which was that, of course, it's a rear engine car. So under the front boot was where the spare tire was. It's the first car I ever had that had windshield washers, but there was no motor pushing the fluid. It actually worked off the pressure from the spare tire. So every time you gassed up, you filled the reservoir, you added air to the tire. German engineering at its finest. The engine was in the back, and if you popped open the back hood, there was a small storage compartment above the engine, then like a little deck. Inside the car, where the speakers were in the rear deck, they were missing because it was a $300 car. Back bumper held on with a bungee cord, and it was an automatic, but you had to start the car in neutral. So after I'd worked at a restaurant bartending for a while, I decided to take some of my money and drive around Winnetka, of all places. I was parked on a side street, got out, came out of a hardware store, walked over to the car, put it in neutral, turned the key, looked in the rearview mirror to back up. This freaking car is on fire. So I jumped out.
Wait, what?
The car was on fire. So I jump out, and the car starts to roll forward because, of course, it's in neutral. So I jump back in and hit the parking brake, turn off the car, and now there is a car filling up with smoke and flames and a puddle of burning gasoline in the street. I was wearing a leather jacket, nothing fancy, kind of like a members only jacket, if you know what that is. So I take it off, and I'm beating out the flames in the street. So now I've got a burning jacket, a burning car, and a puddle of gasoline in the street. And as I'm beating the flames out of my jacket, a woman about a block and a half away comes out of an insurance office, of all places, and yells, "Hey, your car's on fire!" And I paused and went, "Yeah, I noticed." So she goes in, and I assumed to call the fire department, which she did because I could hear sirens coming. And at this point, I gave up on the puddle of gasoline in the street. The car is filling up beautifully with just smoke and flames, and I'm leaning against this beautiful wrought iron gate in front of somebody's freaking mansion in Winnetka, jauntily draping my smoldering jacket over my shoulder, smoking a cigarette as the fire department of Winnetka pulls up. And they send a hook and ladder truck for a car that is 4.5 feet high from the ground to the roof. And I'm on my second cigarette as they unfurl the hoses. They pop open the back where most of the flames are. They crank open the hose, and they're just flooding the back end, and they look at me and they go, "The fire's not going out." And I said, "Yep, you just washed off the toolbox. The engine's underneath the deck." And they're like, "Oh!" So they pop the little deck off, and they flood the engine. Then they open up the door. They rip out the back seat because the battery in this car is very conveniently located underneath the back seat. Another feat of German engineering, and really hysterical when you try to jump someone's car and you run cables out the back window. So now they flood the interior of the car with water, and my jacket, stopped smoking. I stopped smoking at the moment. They're winding up their hoses, and I'm just kind of looking at all the desolation, and they looked at me and they said, "Hey, it's like, what are you going to do with the car?" And I was like, "Why?" And the guy goes, "Well, the firefighter goes, well, you could give it to us." And I said, "What would you guys do with this car?" And they said, "We'd use it for practice." And I said, "Well, I've seen your work. How do I get you the car?" And they said, "Well, just bring us the title." And I go, "Do you guys tow it?" And they're like, "Yeah." I go, "Done." So I walk back to my sister's house. I walk in, smelling, I guess, a little bit like gasoline and embarrassment. And she looks at me and goes, "That was you, wasn't it?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And the next day I took the title to the fire department and never saw the car again.
Do a flip.
Do a flip.